project really came about because we had a very interesting race for the governor of Louisiana. And the two candidates were Edwin Edwards, who had long been accused of criminal activities and had barely escaped charges a couple of times and was kind of proud of that. And David Duke, who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So that sparked a lot of debate and discussion in Louisiana about where we were in terms of race relations if we could have a serious candidate for governor who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. That conversation led the newspaper to say, we really need to take on this topic and look at it in a serious way.
All right. So it's been more than 20 years. Are there still like articles that you remember, or what is your biggest takeaway from the whole project?
Well, I think the biggest surprise for me, well, there are two things. One is how hard it was to talk about race. As journalists, we tend to think, we can set aside our emotions and our own ideologies and biases and deal totally objectively, neutrally with any topic. With race, it's difficult to do that because we all bring perceptions and our own backgrounds and value systems to that topic, and different levels of understanding and very different experiences with race. And so, at first I thought, well, okay, this is a great topic. We'll cover this like we would any good, journalist. And our very first meeting of the group, we had probably 20 people involved in this project. I mean, it just fell apart in about 5 minutes because it was clear we just weren't on the same page about how to approach this topic. And I remember the African Americans in the room said, well, we have to talk about slavery. And the Caucasians in the room are kind of saying, we're a newspaper, not a history book. Why would we talk about slavery? And then, so it was very clear that we just weren't coming at this from the same place, understandably, because our experiences were very different. And so we did several months of working with professionals who led us through a series of intense conversations about race and our own values and belief structures and experiences on that topic. And so we had to go through that kind of a process before we could even talk to each other about what this meant. And before then we could tackle it as journalists to try to explain what this means for other people. So I think that was initially the biggest surprise, which this is really going to be difficult and personally difficult, emotional. You had to do a lot of self-reflection and deep thinking about this to figure out where you were. And then I think the second surprise was how much people really wanted to have the conversation. Often race is not something that people are comfortable talking about. It doesn't always come up in dinner conversation or even between friends who may be of different races, but they sort of just avoid that topic, or they think, oh, it doesn't matter. But society dictates to us that it does matter. And so we need to talk about it. So I was a little surprised how much people sort of just gravitated toward that in terms of our readers. We did, I don't even know how many pages, 80, 100 pages, full pages in the newspaper of just what people had, their own stories and their own experiences about race. There was just this outpouring of people wanting to talk about it. We had people telling us that it was the first time they'd ever had that conversation with a spouse, with a child, with a neighbor. And so it prompted sort of this, there was this pent up, I think, need to talk about this, and this provided an outlet for people to do that.
That's great. So in the end, from May to November, all these articles came out, was there really any resolution, or did you finally get to answer what is race and
Well,
prove the myth?
we tried to answer that question because the name of the project was The Myth of Race. So basically we said it's a social construct. It's not a biological construct. It's something we made up and made important in a way that biologically, physiologically would not be justified. So yeah, it is important, but we've sort of created it as an artifice. So did it all get resolved and all the race problems disappeared after that? No. It's something we're still, people in New Orleans, I'm sure are still talking about, as they are elsewhere. But I do think that it was the first time a major newspaper had approached the subject in the way that we did, which was acknowledging history, which is acknowledging guilt, essentially, for the role that all of us still play in this, by really challenging the assumption that there is that race exists other than as a social construct, really diving into people's experiences with race from the time they're children, when they don't seem to recognize it at all, to the time when we're adults where we say we don't recognize it, but we do. So it was a very sort of honest and a very different kind of approach. A lot of what you still see in terms of coverage of race, when it's covered at all, is sort of black pathology or Latino pathology or Native American pathology, whatever the group is. You know, why are they different? Why are there high crime rates? Why do they do this? Why do they do that? As opposed to looking at it from a totally different perspective, which is, where did this come from? Why does it exist, and how does it play out in our lives, and how do all of us have a role in it?
Okay, from all of that, do you have this, like, a memorable or striking moment or answer, something that totally surprised you from all the things you've researched? I mean, aside from the initial process of you got shocked by how difficult it was to even talk about it amongst your colleagues. I mean, from the answers of the people.
Yeah, I mean, I remember being shocked at the level of hatred. When this was pre-internet, basically, days when we did this, and so the easiest way we could let people talk to us, our readers talk to us, was just open up a phone line. And so we had hours and hours of recorded messages that people left us. And I remember, and the library would print those out for me, and I would take them home at night and read them. And it finally got to the point where I just couldn't read them anymore. It was so disturbing. And there was a lot, I mean, there was a lot of understanding and good things too, but there was a lot of hate there to deal with. And that was hard. And it made me feel sort of hopeless at some points that we were ever going to get past this. Okay. I also remember reading one of our Keith Woods, who's a good friend and now at NPR. I remember he wrote a story that surprised me about racism within the African American community that dealt with hair and shade of a color of skin, shades of color that I didn't know, having not been there and experienced that. So there were a lot of things that I learned, both good and bad, from the project.
I was just curious because I'm really not from here, so I wouldn't know. But in terms of like the level of hatred, I mean, this is from which side? I mean, whose side? And
it was mostly white hatred against black people. Oh yeah, that was pretty clear. There was some of the other, but mostly 99%. It was white racism. Yeah. And again, I don't know if I'd say that was the majority. It wasn't the majority of people, but there was a real vein of hatred that we had to deal with.
Okay, I mean, just a follow up to that. I mean, how comprehensive is this? I mean, how many people were you able to interact with or did really give their...
You know, I'd have to go back and look. I don't remember. I don't
Okay.
remember how, but I think we printed, I don't know, it was dozens and dozens of pages of just people's comments, and we had many more people who called in, and I didn't print the worst ones. I tried to be really honest. I mean, people wanted, one of the things that surprised me was that we would print some fairly, you know, some fairly outspoken comments from white people about black people, for example. And black people would respond. People were like having these conversations by leaving phone messages, and the response on the part of the African Americans was often, oh, I thought it was worse than that. I thought what they really thought was worse than that. And I'm going, worse? You thought it was worse? And they're like, oh yeah, this is not nearly as bad as I thought it would be. So that was kind of that was an interesting dynamic. And also the fact that, I mean, people would call in and say, I just want to respond to what Joe Schmidt said. You know, and here's what I think. And then Joe would call in and say, I just want to respond to that guy who responded to me. And we'd have these conversations that now take place online, of course. And so it ended up being a very interesting dialogue that developed through the pages of the newspaper.
All right. Okay, man, let's move on. So in present day, how do you think race is portrayed now by the media? I mean, has it changed? I mean, from before, from the time that you published those articles? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been some progression. I mean, just the fact that Obama is now president has prompted some examination of how we see race in this country, and to some extent has prompted people to talk about it and to write about it. But I still think that, and I think we're more careful with things like racial identifications. Most newspapers are used to, they would just describe a suspect as, you know, a black, mid-20s black man, you know, 5'10", which could describe like how many thousands and thousands of people, so it sort of labeled everybody. And I think newspapers now are much more careful, and news organizations in general are more careful about using racial identifiers that are so broad as to be meaningless. I think that's progress that we've made. But I do think that in general, we still just don't talk about it very much. And unless something happens, like, you know, police officers shooting African American men, you know, or beating somebody up on the street, or, you know, when there's an incident, usually involving police and members of minority groups, racial profiling and traffic stops, things like that. So it tends to come up, but in a narrow context of sort of police relationships and the relationships of minority communities to the criminal justice system. And that's an important conversation to have, but it's only one slice of the conversation. So I still think that there's a lot we don't talk about.
Like, are there, when it comes to race coverage, do you think there are more areas of improvement?
Well, I gave you a couple.
Yeah, like the racial profiling.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're doing better with that. I think that, and I think having President Obama in office has prompted some discussions that have been fruitful, although he's kind of shied away from it in some senses. Maybe I think sometimes he doesn't want to get too far ahead of people. So I think there's still a lot that could be discussed. We have a younger generation, at least I observed that, you know, like my kids who are in their 20s sort of think, oh, the problems have all been solved. You know, well, what's there to talk about? You know, we're past that. That was your problem, you know, back 20 years ago. But I don't think all the problems clearly have been solved. And that's true with, you know, gender discrimination and other kinds of discrimination. But I think in some ways they talk about it even less or think about it even less because there's in some ways so accepting of differences that they think, okay, you know, I don't have a problem, then nobody has a problem. Society doesn't have a problem. Well, yeah, there are still some problems we need to deal with, as evidenced by, you know, things that have happened, encounters with police departments, for example. So, still things we need to talk about.
All right, ma'am, just last two questions. Do you think there's a difference between race coverage in Louisiana and here in Arizona?
Well, I mean, it's hard to draw parallels or you know, point out things that are different, but I think that essentially no. I mean, I think that I mean the minority group we're talking about is different. In Arizona, you're talking primarily about Latino and residents. And in Louisiana, it's primarily white and African American as opposed to white and Latino or Caucasian and Latino. So, I mean, I think the racial group is different, but essentially the issues remain the same. There is some difference. There is a difference when slavery is involved. I mean, there is a history and a weight associated with just what happened, the history of what happened to African Americans in this country that can't be ignored, and that affects today all kinds of things. So I do think there's sort of that extra weight when it comes to African American communities, but in a lot of ways, you know, trust issues, you know, stereotyping people, traffic stops. There are all kinds of things that are similar.
All right. Josh, do you want to do your last question, the magic wand question?
Yeah, I always like to ask this one. So you have like a magic wand and you can just fix one problem.
Do you want to see my magic wand?
What would you fix if you like?
Oh boy, what would I fix? Boy, I don't know. You know, I think what I would do is ask people to actually engage on the topic, to think about it, to talk about it, and to try to do so without a lot of barriers and self-protection. That if we could really open up and talk to people about this, and express even views that are going to be, you know, hurtful in some cases to people, then maybe we can start progressing from there. I think by saying, oh, it's not a problem and I'm not going to talk about it or think about it, that's clearly a way that nothing will get accomplished. So I think we just have to sort of deal with it. And I think, you know, I'm not saying nobody does that, because there are people who do that clearly. But as a society, that doesn't seem to be a high priority. There are a lot of other things we'd rather talk about.